the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is making a surprise visit to Kyiv to meet President Volodymyr Zelensky. Now, this will be Mr. Kishida's first trip to Ukraine since the Russian invasion a year ago. He's expected to assure President Zelensky of Tokyo's continued support. Now, the Japanese government says it wants to focus on reconstruction and humanitarian aid for Ukraine while pushing for hard sanctions against Russia.
Arise chief correspondent John Cookson has been monitoring developments, and he joins us now from London for more. John, thank you so much for joining us on Newsday. What has China's Xi Jinping been doing today, and what's on the agenda for the rest of the day?
Hi, ladies. Great to be on Newsday. He was up bright and early with that meeting, as you talked about there, with Russian Prime Minister Putin. And he said that the two nations had never been closer ever in history, and that they were two great neighbouring powers. So it was a sort of togetherness, bromance, if you like, today with the Russian Prime Minister. All this, of course, a curtain raiser for a meeting that Xi has later at this hour, in fact, with President Putin, when they get down to really serious talks. Last night, both Putin and Xi had dinner together. It was a state banquet. They had fish soup, they had fish. They also dined on omelette and quail, and I'm sure the atmosphere was electric, and again, another togetherness meeting at the Kremlin with the two leaders. So all symbolic, of course, but the real business gets done today. I think at some point there'll be a press conference, we think, later with Putin and Xi. So a busy second day for President Xi. He returns to China tomorrow.
Oh, well, that banquet certainly does sound very luxurious for a country that's at war. But Putin and Xi are likely to discuss China's 12-point peace plan for Ukraine. Now, has it got any chance of being accepted by Kyiv?
Not at the moment, not by Ukraine, and certainly the White House isn't buying it. Just remind ourselves what this so-called peace plan is. It calls for an end to hostilities. It also talks about hostilities ceasing, leading to peace talks. It also mentions securing the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant and making that safe, and the normalization of grain exports to the rest of the world. It also calls for an end to unilateral sanctions on Russia. But nowhere, crucially, nowhere in this peace plan does it say that Russian forces must withdraw from Ukrainian territory. And currently they're occupying 17% of the country. And unless and until they withdraw back to proper Russian territory, there's no way that Zelensky is going to accept that. So on the face of it, it's an effort by China, which has to be applauded. But look, there's nothing in it that Zelensky and Western nations, including America, are going to accept. So it has to be adapted in some way.
Well, thank you, John. Now, what are we likely to hear at the two leaders' press conference later?
We'll hear something about trade, increased trade. I mean, these two nations are great trading partners. The Russians and the Chinese import and export a lot of billions and billions of dollars of goods between the two countries. China, of course, very keen on Russian oil and gas, and we'll hear something about that. But what I think the rest of the world will be looking for is whether China calls for a ceasefire in the Ukraine conflict. And obviously diplomats across the world will be watching very closely as to whether China does set out another element of the peace plan and whether he in fact calls for a ceasefire, because he would not do that unless this had previously been agreed with Putin. He wouldn't want to embarrass Putin in a press conference. So a crucially important day of talks between these two leaders.
Now, of course, also happening in the region is a Japanese Prime Minister's visit to Kyiv. How significant is this particular visit?
Well, it's symbolic more than anything. I think Kishida has come under some criticism because he was the only G7 leader that hasn't been to Kyiv. since the war began. He wasn't due to go. He was actually meeting the Indians in central India, had a meeting there. But then his plane diverted to Poland, and he took the long train journey that I took recently to Kyiv and arrived just an hour or so ago. I think it's the optics that are important here. Here you have, on the one hand, you have the Chinese and Russian leaders shown images together across the world. But now, later today, we'll see Zelensky with the Japanese Prime Minister. The Japanese Prime Minister, of course, an ally of Western nations. So it's a kind of balancing out that's going on here.
Well, thank you so much, John. Now, in other developments, could you just touch on what's going on with the International Criminal Court and, Vladimir Putin for a moment, if you're hearing any new developments?
Well, there was a crucial meeting yesterday in London at Lancaster House when 40 justice ministers met for the first time to talk about more evidence for more war crimes and allegations against President Putin. There are thousands and thousands of examples of that in Ukraine. I met one example, a young man who was shot by the Russians, but the Russians also shot his brother and his father in front of him. I interviewed him on Arise News last March. And then recently I was in Bucha, north of Kyiv, where war crimes have been carried out there. I mean, everywhere that Russia has been in action in Ukraine, war crimes, alleged war crimes have been carried out. And this evidence has to be compiled. And eventually, the perpetrators brought to book. There might not always be leaders. It could be individual soldiers. So all this is going on in the background. All the evidence is there, is being gathered. There's lots of video evidence, a lot of written evidence, and it may well be that in the years to come, there will be a trial at the International Criminal Court. There's a caveat to all of this, is that all of this has to be proved, and this is going to take a long, long time. War crimes tribunals don't happen overnight. They take years to take place. So we're looking, maybe 5, even 10 years into the future here.
Right, and still on that ICC warrant, now many analysts are saying there's pressure on South Africa to see how they will react, because of course Vladimir Putin is expected to be in South Africa for the BRICS Economic Summit coming up in the next few weeks. Do you think that this is sensationalism? Will South Africa actually risk doing anything to Vladimir Putin while he's on South African soil?
Not a hope. Remember, there was a similar arrest warrant for the Sudanese leader some years ago, and the South Africans did nothing. Look, Russia and South Africa are pretty much in lockstep at the moment. Now, whether Putin will actually make that visit to a conference, which is this summer sometime, we'll have to wait and see. But even if he does, I can't see the South Africans arresting President Putin. No, absolutely not.
Well, fantastic analysis, as always. Arise Chief Correspondent John Cookson, thank you so much for joining us on Newsday. We appreciate your time, as always.